Is it about the journey or the destination?
This podcast is brought to you by ArchMed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of Archimed.
And I'm Caroline Squattrigo, talent engagement specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us.
All right, Caroline, what's the question of the day?
Today we're going to talk about the importance of the process. It can be really easy to focus on the results, and I think often a lot of people forget that there's so much that goes on during the journey to get there. I know I'm a big culprit of that. And often during that journey, we might decide to pivot or work towards a new result. So there's a lot that can happen in that time frame. So how do we navigate that? Results are obviously important, but we can get too caught up in the goal, and sometimes that leads to disregarding all of that good stuff that happens in the process. So to help us out with this, we'll be talking to Dr. Tracy Brower. She is the author of The Secret to Happiness. But first, I'm excited because we're going to welcome back my dad, Jim, for his take on this. And I think he has a couple of fun stories he wants to share.
All right.
So today we have the privilege of once again being joined by my dad, Jim. Right now, he's the CEO of Garlock Printing and Converting in Massachusetts. Dad, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you again on such lofty topics.
Thanks. Um, so today we are talking about kind of a process versus results debate. So results are obviously important, but I think there is the potential to miss a lot of important things if we get too dialed in on the result. And you are someone that growing up, I often heard, Caroline, is it about the destination or is it about the journey? So I thought you might be a good person to have on. And I also know that you deal with this a lot at work. So what do you think, Dad? What's your take on this?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways to view process and results. And I think as humans, we engage in processes all the time without even thinking about it. And when the earlier conversation we had to do with culture, I think when you think about results, does the end justify the means or vice versa? Or we want to get certain results, and should we focus on the results or should we focus on the process? In a business environment or in a team environment, there are some extra factors, I think, that we have to consider. So it becomes a little deeper topic or a deeper discussion to get through all those. But fundamentally, I think we deal with processes every day and we deal with results every day. And sometimes as we go through life, we develop habits, which are really processes, but just nobody thinks about it that way. So I think in general life, people don't think about it too much, but in business, we tend to get caught up in it, especially in manufacturing companies, I might add.
So I know you have a lot of stories and you're constantly dealing with things like this. Can you share one with our listeners and maybe if you like learned a lesson from it or how you approach when you're looking at a new goal, how you approach queuing everybody up for this?
Yeah, so I honestly, I mean, it's an interesting question that you ask. And when I like the work I do is usually I come into companies and they're often privately owned or private equity owned, and they want the company to do better and create value and so forth. So I don't usually start by talking about a process. I think you and I have probably chatted about this before. Um, what I usually start talking about is where we want to go, how we want to get there. And so let me just digress a minute, okay? So to give you some real world examples. So you know I like a good espresso, right?
Yes, I do.
And you know there's a right way to make an espresso, right?
Obviously, this is something that you've taught me a lot about.
Yeah, but so and what I mean by that is, okay, we have, and you know that when we get focused on something, we have to do it better, 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 right? So the concept of making a good espresso or making a better espresso all the time, what we're really doing is going back and adjusting the process, right? There's a process for making an espresso that everybody uses. But we often, when I say we, you and I, and our family, we get focused on how do we do it better, and we don't say it has to, we don't force the better, right? We force the process. Let's try this, let's try that, let's use different coffee beans, let's use different water, right?
Yeah, but I think you're good at living in the process, but I'll get frustrated. Like if I can't get it right. And then I think that's where I'm bypassing the process. I just want the quick result.
Yeah, but so you may be able to get a quick result without adjusting the process, but I would bet that you're finding a process that gets you what you want.
So what about if you get lost in the process? Then what happens?
Well, that's not good either. So the thing is, the thing that the way I think about it is we're trying to achieve something, right? We're trying to pick up a mooring on a sailboat in stormy seas, right? And so we don't start by picking up a mooring in stormy seas. We start by picking up a mooring when the water is calm, right? But the objective is to pick up the mooring. So if you just say, you know, we're going to have a process to go out there and pick something up out of the water, I'd get pretty bored with that, because there's no accomplishment associated with that. But if we say, hey, we really want to be good at picking up this mooring, and we want to do it the first time every time, right? So that's a way to think about it. But we never call it a process. We just say, hey, you're going to do this, I'm going to do that. And we get confidence in each other because we practice and we do it over, and we almost can anticipate what each of us is going to do because it usually requires maybe three of us to get it done, right?
Mhm.
So the same thing with making a good espresso. It's about having a good espresso, yes, but if you forget about the process, then you might get coffee, a regular coffee instead of an espresso. And if you forget about the end result, you might get water, you know what I mean? And you might say water is fine. So it's linked. I view them as pretty closely linked. It's hard to do one without the other, but we don't often, like you just mentioned, we don't always think about it the same way, or often uh, think about the fact that there are processes that we're going through to make things happen.
All right. Well, we will see what our expert Tracy Brower has to say about that, and I guess after we talk to her, we'll see if you're right, Dad.
Well, let me add one more dimension to that,
Okay, add one more dimension.
because I mentioned earlier in a business environment, and since you and I first started talking about this, maybe just in the last week, I've given it a bit of thought, because when you talk about this in a work environment, there are a number of different contexts. And I would say in a work environment or a team environment or an environment where there are other people involved. So when you're making a good espresso on your own, you can do whatever you want. You can change the process, you can get it better, and then you can talk about it and share that, right?
Mhm.
When you're doing things with a team, there's another dynamic that I think comes into play. And pick a manufacturing process on a production line or a production machine, or pick a decision making process that you use when businesses have to make decisions and you're trying to get a team aligned on the same page. And I think in the case of business and in the case of teams or in the case of multiple people, the dynamic that comes into play is has more to do with how the team interacts and how much integrity the team has in committing to what they're going to do and following through with what they say they're going to do, and in getting the team to trust each other, right? So if you establish a process for making a decision, and I do that all the time, and you do that all the time, and I don't talk about the process. I just I just talk about, hey, here's what we're going to do. I don't say, hey, we're going to go through a decision making process, but I'll get everybody together and we'll talk about it. Everybody has their chance to make their contribution, and in the end, if everybody agrees, we go that way, and if they don't agree, I'll make the call, right? But if I violate that one day and I just walk in the room and say, I decided to go do this without having told anybody what we were thinking of doing, I think I would lose I would lose a lot of integrity, and I would lose the confidence and trust of my team, right? Just because I did something differently, I violated a trust, and we never talked about it, but inherently, as you get teams together and you work with them, they start to trust the way you do things, and it's an inherent thing, right? And if you violate that just by changing something unilaterally or arbitrarily, then you lose that and you have to rebuild it, right? So that there's an interesting dynamic or interesting added perspective, I think, that occurs when you're talking about management processes or processes that involve multiple people, right? Because it's part of what bonds everybody together and part of what allows everybody to rely on each other and trust each other and have confidence in each other. And that's something that I think you have to be careful you don't overlook. So if you just go to the result in a management environment and you avoid that process or you violate the process, I think there's a lot of damage. Comment I made earlier about the results and the process are linked, I think it still applies, but there's an extra risk in the management environment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we've learned throughout this podcast that people really seek to understand. And if there's that lack of understanding or lack of knowledge around the why, that can really throw everybody off. So that's probably where the process comes into play when working with a team and a company.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool.
And
Well,
I'm just to hear if I'm right, because if I'm not right, I will want to improve the process so I'm better at it.
okay, if you're not right, Dad, we're going to do a follow up to this after we talk to Tracy so that Greg and I can confront you head on and say, here's what happened. We'll give you the gift of feedback.
Sounds fantastic.
All
I'll look
right.
into that.
Cool. Thanks, Dad.
All right, Caroline, we'll see you. Bye bye.
Bye. Okay, well, today we are joined by Dr. Tracy Brower. Dr. Brower has a PhD in sociology and studies work life fulfillment and happiness. Tracy's work has been featured in both TEDx and the Wall Street Journal. And she's also an author of The Secret to Happiness at Work and Bring Work to Life by Bringing Life to Work. Glad I did not butcher that title. I had a feeling I was going to get tripped up on it. But Tracy, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we are really excited to dive in here. We're talking today about, do companies get too focused on that results oriented mentality? And is it counterproductive? And should we really be focusing on that learning culture? I know you've done a lot of work on this. So, I mean, right off the top, what's your take? Is it more beneficial for companies to focus on that performance culture or learning culture, or is it somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in the middle. Sometimes I think that we set up the performance culture and the learning culture, and it ends up being like a false dichotomy. Like we think we have to choose between them, and actually they build on each other. Like when we are a really effective learning culture, our performance is better. And when we're performing well, an inherent part of that is the learning that we do that goes along with it. I think that there's kind of a like, that idea that anything taken to an extreme is less helpful, right? Anything out of balance is less helpful. And so you don't want to push on performance so much that people just get burned out and they never feel like they're doing enough. You don't want to emphasize learning so much that there's, no accountability and we're just around here to kind of learn cool things. You need a both and, I think, in terms of both of those pieces.
I'm probably oversimplifying this, but I think about when I've learned the most in my career, and it's through failure. And then I also think about when my performance was lowest. It was at failure points. And so you do learn from failures, but failures really do sting the income statement.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think that, I think one of the interesting things is time. Like, time is the element that doesn't give us the opportunity to do lots and lots and lots of each of those. And so we have to have enough time to try and experiment and fail. And we have to spend enough time like really performing the work so we can, get stuff done and meet our KPIs. And so I think that is part of the constraint. And I feel like a really big part of it is a culture that finds a way to embrace both. Like, how do we create a sense of psychological safety, which I know you all talk about? how do we create the opportunity for risk taking? Because if we don't take risks, we can't innovate, we can't learn something new. On the other hand, we also need to hold people accountable for results. And so I think it's partly about a what and a how. Like the what of, we have to drive results, and we need to do it in a way that allows for some risk taking, allows for some failure, allows for us to fail forward. There was a great boss I worked for years ago, and he used to talk about, like, people would show up with their Excel spreadsheet and all the cells would be green. And he would say, we're not doing something right if all the cells are green in terms of our progress. Either we're not stretching enough, or we're not being honest about what we're not doing well. So I think there's also an honesty component, an authenticity component that says, I've got to be able to share if I've got a yellow light on something, so that I can get help from my colleagues, so that I can figure out how to make that light green with mutual support.
Yeah, I was thinking about that just the other day in one of my companies as we were celebrating the win of a certain KPI, but it was so low, and we wanted it to be low. It was so low, it made me wonder: are we taking enough risk? Should it be actually a little higher? Which was sort of the reverse way of looking at it. And when I think about failure in that context, I would like to create the psychological safety you referenced in order to allow people to bring that failure to light. But I really only get comfortable with that kind of failure if the failure is a result of, at the time, good judgment, so that we decided this is the risk. We really assessed it. We really got comfortable with it. There was a dialogue around it. We looked at the return potential and the possible downside scenarios. And then we had the psychological safety to fail early enough so that we could pivot and still ultimately be successful. That's the paradigm I'm looking for.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you're pointing to something that I think is a really helpful concept to use. And that is kind of that idea of the value chain. Like, let's fail early. Let's fail internally. Let's fail in early enough in the process that we're learning and we can iterate. But let's try to not fail externally. Let's try to not fail in the face of our customers or in view of our customers. That's not always possible. But I also feel like there's judgment around who participates in the decisions that might be high risk. Like, if I'm early in the value chain and my failure isn't a high risk, I might kind of do some interesting things and I can kind of make those decisions by myself and use my individual judgment. But as we get down that value chain closer to the customer and we're doing things that might have a greater risk and more visibility externally, then I feel like we need more people involved in making that decision to take that risk. It's kind of that in the olden days, in the automotive industry. Early in my career, I worked in the automotive industry, and we used to do failure modes effects analysis. And it was basically it was a 2x2 model that said, how likely is the risk, and if we fail, how great is the problem that will occur. And there was kind of a red, yellow, green model that said, boy, if the risk is really damaging and if it's a really high likelihood of risk, then we need to treat that differently as an organization, as compared to a small risk, right? So I feel like there's almost like when you're in a learning culture, when you're in a performance culture, there's almost a mindset of assessing that risk in an organic way on an ongoing basis, so that we're able to learn and take risks, but they're the appropriate risks and they don't get in the way of performance.
I wonder if I could go on a tangent there. That paradigm, that box, right, where you have high low on one axis and high low on the other. What about the two other boxes where you are either you could take a high risk of failure, but the cost of the failure is low, or you could take a low risk of failure, but the cost of the failure is high. Those are philosophies. Where do you think one ought to end up in that kind of paradigm?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I know the answer to that. I feel like if something is a low risk, there should be more empowerment by people to try. Because like I was thinking about the concept of thriving. There's been so much research on thriving, and especially in the areas of uh, athletics, and especially in the areas of childhood development. And thriving has to do with a few different components. It has to do with a sense of happiness, like you feel like you're making a contribution, you feel satisfied, you feel fulfilled. It has a component of accomplishment, and it has a component of learning. And so I feel like that empowerment piece, like if the risk is low, like if the potential damage is low, we should empower people because that is part of that thriving that they can do. If the potential damage is much higher, then that may be something that we want to participate in helping somebody make a decision or make that a group effort versus an individual effort so that we're still able to learn deeply, but we're also able to ensure performance.
Yeah, I think I come out pretty similarly. I think about it in terms of risk and exposure, and I like the idea of empowering people even at high risk. So you may have more failures, but your ultimate exposure, the cost of those failures is relatively low. And I think maybe that's what gets us a lot of learning, a lot of growth without a lot of cost. What do you think, Caroline?
Yeah, I mean, I think about so I'm on like the hiring side, so I'm always thinking about this from like an onboarding perspective. And I think about our interns. And one thing that I always tell our interns is like, look, we're going to give you real responsibilities, but let's be honest, you're an intern and you're allowed to fail. Cuz we always get these interns who come in, and I was the same way, and I think it's good that this is in them, but they're so terrified of failing that they end up a lot of times doing nothing, because they come to me and they're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. What happens now? And that's where I try to, like you were mentioning, fail early. It's like, this is when you're allowed to fail, and this is when the learning should happen, because I'm not going to give you anything that you're going to lose the company like millions of dollars if you mess up. I think about, I used to be picking out a wall decal when I was a marketing intern here and so terrified of messing it up. And our CEO would be like, Caroline, we will order a new one. It's not, it's okay. And then it's like, obviously as I've grown, those learning opportunities have become a little bigger and a little scarier. But I also don't fail as much, knock on wood. Now I feel like I have a failure coming my way. Um, but but I think I agree. We have to weigh the risk and the learning opportunity. But I really love the time. I love having our interns in the building because I love watching them fail. Like, I know it sounds weird, but like, I love watching them become more comfortable with failure, I guess I should say. And I will tell them all of my stories to make them feel a little more comfortable. I will not share them all on this podcast. Those stay internal, but but I love watching that process happen.
Have you ever failed you mentioned wall decal. Have you ever had a wall decal
Yes, Greg,
failure?
you know this because I believe you sent me the picture. I I painstakingly hung up this wall decal and there was a misspelled word. And Greg sent me a picture of the word, and he also sent me like a screenshot of dictionary.com just in case I would dispute that the word was spelled wrong. And it was like at the end of a long day, and I was in the car with John, our CEO, and I looked at him and I was like, I can't even respond to him right now. He's like, order a new one. We are thankfully able to order just the word. So it wasn't that bad. It
Yeah,
cost us like $5. We are all
perfect.
good. But yes, I have failed.
I think there's so much in what you said. And I'm thinking about my own stories about, oh God, the years and years and years ago, there was this like executive report, and in the footer had like their tagline for the big change they were going through. And it was like, the power of shift or something like that. And God forbid I left out the F in the word. I mean, it was just like this terrible, terrible, terrible mistake. But we've all been there, right? And story and reflection are so critical. Like I feel like that's another really important part of an effective learning and performance culture is time for reflection. Like that Deming plan, do, check, act cycle. And a lot of times in our Western culture, we leave out the plan and we leave out the check, right? Like we do an act and do an act. And learning really requires us to reflect. And it doesn't have to be a long, protracted process, but it really requires us to think, okay, like, what did I do well? What could I have done differently? That's one. I think another thing in what you said that's so critical is community and connection. Like, like Greg sent you that photo and said, "Hey, you spelled this wrong," right? Like he's got your back at some level. Like and when we go through really difficult times, those are the times when we bond the most. And so I feel like there's also this, if we have a culture of both performance and learning, we are building community, we are building connection, and you need that sense of connection and community in order for people to feel that sense of psychological safety as well. Because if I fail and then I'm hanging out there in the breeze and everybody else is running the other way, that's a really different feeling than, I wish I could have done that better, but I know my team still supports me, right? Like I feel like that issue of reflection, storytelling, and that issue of community are both really important as we think about a learning performance culture.
Well, and I think taking the little failures kind of hard at the beginning is important too. Like looking back, of course, I'm like, Caroline, it was one word. It was really like two letters that were swapped or something. And but I took that so hard. Like I spent like 6 hours being like, "Ugh, how could you have done that?" And now I'm like double checking my work constantly, you know? So I think that's where it all comes in. Um, when we're creating that culture of community, I think it's something that we really strive for, but it's not always easy to actually enact. Do you have suggestions for how, like, from a management team or even just like the entire team, how do we support each other in that way so that we feel comfortable with that reflection piece and supporting each other through our failures?
Yeah, I think that's the $6 million question, right? Like, how do we do it? How are we really pragmatic about it? One, I think that leaders can reinforce kind of an overall sense of purpose and big picture, right? Like, you're always remembering why you are in it and why you're seeking to experiment, test, try. I think another is that leaders can provide plenty of appreciation and recognition for what each of us brings uniquely. And not just recognition for success, but also recognition for progress, not just for failure, but for progress and learning, right? Like, wow, I'm not going to recognize the fact that you spelled that thing wrong on that wall, but I am going to recognize the fact that you recovered quickly, that you asked for feedback, you were able to work through it really effectively with the client, right? Like I'm going to celebrate and appreciate the process that you went through and how it helped us fail forward. I think a third thing we can do is kind of unite people in team work together. Like a lot of times there's a misconception that we build teams through social interaction, but teams are actually more powerfully built through task. And so part of the way that we create a learning culture is by creating those strong bonds together. So I'm new and I'm going to learn from you because we're going to have a formal buddy relationship or a formal mentor relationship. Or I'm newer and I'm learning in a new way, and you're going to put a team around me and I'm going to get embedded with a team so that I can learn and fail, but I'm doing that in an environment where we together are seeking to finish the task, pursue a mutual goal, learn together. I think those are a few things that leaders can do to help kind of create this sense of psychological safety. And I think giving lots of feedback too is another one, not just recognition, but feedback. Like, here's what worked well, here's what worked less well. When people know that leaders are attentive, they tend to give more discretionary effort. They tend to be more willing to kind of set stretch goals because they know that somebody has their back. They're not kind of out there on their own. So I feel like there's a real close relationship between learning, performance, and community.
Right. I agree with that. we're really trying hard on the community side, and that's really one of the biggest pieces that drove this journey that Caroline and I are on, about creating uh, a certain type of community within our organization, one that does support those at times of mistakes and things like that. Um, my dad is an entrepreneur, and he wrote a book about the 10 things you don't learn in business school, and nearly all of those things he learned at a point of failure. And then I've met many entrepreneurs in my life, not a single one of which has never had a failure. They've all had a failure. So the idea is to sort of reframe this from failure is loss, failure is bad, failure is avoidable, to we want to have more successes than failures. And when you sum it all up, you want the sum to be a success. So it's hard to do, though. If you're an entrepreneur, that's an easy thing. It's sort of what it's your ecosystem. But if you are, let's say, programming a machine, failure is anathema. And so I think it's a philosophical construct that's different between those two, or even just straight up background of how of the lens through which you view the world and failure. How do you bridge those two opinions? Failure is unavoidable and it should be embraced, to I want to bat 1,000.
I think you're absolutely pointing to the idea of growth mindset. We have so gotten to the point in our Western culture that we raise children and we reinforce adults that we shouldn't have any failure. If we're doing it right, we're never failing. We're just taking positive steps forward in our career and our promotions and our work accomplishments at every single step. And we give everybody the award, right? Everybody gets an award, and growth mindset suggest, and the outcomes of doing that are that people don't stretch as far. The negative implication is, if I've got to win every time, then I'm going to hedge my bets and I'm not going to stretch as far, work as hard, set big goals, because it's more about the gold star than it is about the learning that came from it. That's the negative consequence socially and societally. The alternative is a growth mindset that says that we can absolutely grow, that we don't have a fixed set of capabilities that will either get us there or not. We can grow, we can learn, we can work hard. It's kind of like saying, oh, great job, you accomplished it because you're so smart. But smart is a fixed mindset that says you're either smart or you're not smart, right? A growth mindset would say, great job, you accomplished it because you worked so hard and you invested so much of yourself into it and so much of your passion into it. And so I feel like this growth mindset is one that allows us to set bigger goals. It's kind of that entrepreneurial mindset that says, I'm gonna reach for something that's a challenge. There's a reason that basketball nets are the height that they are, right? Like if they were lower, you'd make a basket every time and that wouldn't be motivating. If it were higher, you'd never make it and that's not motivating. You need that like level of trying that is motivational. I think the other thing to think about, Greg, you pointed to this and it makes me think that it's also about context. Like if I'm responsible for PMs on a machine, and if I do it wrong, there's going to be huge safety implications, then that is not a place to embrace failure. But there might be other parts of my life where I can embrace failure. And all of my research on happiness, when people are happier, they set bigger goals and they're more likely to reach those goals. In addition, when people are doing things that make them happy outside of work, they tend to perceive more happiness inside of work. So if I'm responsible for PMs on a machine, I am not going to embrace the opportunity for failure in that particular job. But I might go do volunteer work that allows me to learn something, stretch, grow in a new way. I might do something in my personal life that just, kind of pushes and challenges me. So I think it's also contextual. It's not like some universal thing that says all failure is good in all situations. It's more about a growth mindset, an emphasis on learning, an emphasis on growth is just a really good thing generally. And then we need to be smart about where we choose to employ that. I don't know if that makes any sense to either of
Absolutely.
you.
That's the airline pilot analogy, right? There are certain areas of the world where a failure should be avoided at 100% avoidance of failure. And so I do like the idea of thinking about the level of acceptance of failure changing based on the context. Yeah, that's helpful.
This entire conversation makes me think of Sarah Blakely from Spanx, because she is notorious for talking about failure and how that's helped her become who she is. And I think, I'm not quoting this right, I'm sure, but she talks about, every night growing up, her dad at dinner would look at her and her siblings and say, "What have you failed at today?" And if they came to the dinner table and hadn't failed at anything, that's when he would be, whether it was like disappointed or telling them that's not true, you need to think a little harder. But they were expected to come with a failure ready. And I think that speaks to the reflection piece. And I think the idea is then she had the courage to try to start Spanx and all of that. And if she failed, that's something she was comfortable with. But that's something that we have talked about with our new hires too, who we can tell they're like in the perfectionist mindset. And I tell their managers, tell them to come to your one-on-ones with a failure, and not to be punished, but to like tell them to come and like say, "I'm expecting you to bring up a failure that you had," because they're scared to tell you what they need help with, and this is going to give you the insight into what they need help with. And that's of course where the reflection piece comes in, and the learning. So I mean, it's all making sense, and I think it's something we need to keep top of mind that we might not always do.
Caroline, I have an idea.
Let me hear it.
What if we expand our onboarding program to include a discussion of the new hires manager, that person's failure? So the manager, as part of the onboarding process, says, "And I just want to tell you about a failure I've had at work."
Yeah.
And I think that might set the stage for, okay, this is how we view failure, and it becomes normative. Because I can tell you, when I read my father's book about his failure, he got in the racquetball business in the 80s. It was a big fad. And then the fad faded. And when he sold the last racquetball club at closing, he had to give the buyer a check.
Yeah, and that might build the
that
community
was a
piece.
failure.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, wow.
There are
If he failed, then
there are
I can
some
fail.
communities and some
So that gave
companies
me
that have
some
been experimenting with failure
psychological
labs.
freedom to
There's one
stretch and
community
try
in
hard,
particular where
knowing
they
that
have failure
doing
labs,
that
and it's
will
kind of
cause
like
a
doing
failure or two in my life.
like a little TEDx presentation. You go on stage and you talk about a failure, and people from the community show up and they're supportive and all that kind of thing. And I've seen companies now and then, not tons and tons, but now and then companies that will do something similar where you're telling stories about failure. And I think one thing we have to be careful of is that true failure can be really gut wrenching. It can be painful, right? Like, oh God, I feel ashamed. I feel sad. I feel, whatever. I feel like I'm kind of at rock bottom in terms of reassessing my capability. So at the same time, we want to embrace failure and risk taking. I think we also don't want to idealize it or make light of it. Neither of you are doing that. I'm just going in another kind of trajectory that I think is also really interesting. Like, it's tough. And so there's this beautiful, wonderful, like, learning, and where did you stumble and what did you learn? And that can be really different than, oh my gosh, I went through this time in my career where, I made really, really, really bad decisions, and I, wish I could have done it over again, right? Like, we've all been in lots of the former and probably some of the latter as well. So I think it's also this interesting balance of, like, how do you embrace failure and how do you make it safe for people to share some of those stumbles? And that leads to performance, right? We can innovate when we can ask for help. We can innovate when we don't already know the answer. We can perform well when we have learned enough that we can absolutely, kind of crank on the next project or opportunity.
And that leads me to another question for you. You mentioned that a good set of guardrails is try not to fail externally, right? So that you fail internally before the customer is aware of it, and try not to fail too expensively. I think I'm paraphrasing that. Can you give us any advice on what we could do? Are there things we can do as leaders of our organization to set up a structure or guardrails or an ethos about allowing failure, but trying to avoid that external and or expensive failure?
Yeah, wouldn't it be interesting if we could do a really great job in like our performance management systems where we set expectations for people to spend a certain amount of time experimenting. Obviously we have expectations set about their performance levels, but we have expectations about how much time they'll spend experimenting. We have regular coaching sessions that we establish that leaders will have with employees where we talk about what we've stumbled or what we want to stretch toward or where we want to learn. Maybe we have guardrails or principles or guidelines about when you make a decision, there are certain criteria which help you decide whether you need more input before you take action, right? Like that would help us keep the failures less expensive or less external. I think another thing that we can do is set expectations with employees, about what we value, but maybe also set expectations with customers. If I mean, you have to try something new in the market eventually. So maybe we're setting an expectation with customers that this is a pilot, this is a beta. We haven't done this 600 times. We want to try it with you. Sometimes I think we want to be less transparent with customers. We want to be perfect with our customers. And I think sometimes we have those trusted customers where we really can kind of, open the screen and let them see and let them participate with us in some of our invention. You wouldn't do that with every customer. You're not going to mass market that. But there are probably those opportunities where we could set systems and structures that would allow for some of that. So setting expectations would be another one as well.
Well, that's been very helpful. All this has been very helpful as we meander our way through this learning journey that we're on. And I like a lot of aspects of both the performance culture and the learning culture. And our goal is to try and figure out how to marry those two together and avoid that inverse relationship that sometimes can occur. And I think some of the things you've shared with us will help us figure that out. I think it's going to be a pendulum. We're never going to quite hit that sweet spot, but we're going to swing this way and that way. And I think that's maybe an analogy, right? We're never going to we're going to have small failures as the pendulum swings too far one way or the other, and it's unavoidable. But that's what it takes if you're going to try and be a success and get both of these wonderful cultures together to work for us. So thank you so much. We loved having you on, and we're going to link your books in our comment section so that people can easily find them and buy them. And is there anything else you wanted to share with our listeners?
No, I don't think so. I think just one other thing I would build on. You talked about this swinging and pendulum. I think it's about that dynamic tension, right? It's about that both and the appropriate tension that exists between performance and learning. So I love your comments and love our discussion. Thank you for the opportunity to be on with you. I really appreciate it.
Dr. Tracy Brower, thanks so much. We loved having you. Well, that was a lot of fun. I think this is a really important topic because it impacts who you hire and how you develop people. That dynamic tension between performance culture and learning culture really brings out who you are as an organization.
Yeah, Tracy had so much to add on this topic. And she reiterated, it is a balance. We obviously still have to see those results to be a functioning and successful business, but we need to live in that process as well. And I really loved the conversation that we had around failure and the importance of, leaders and mentors in the company openly sharing their failures and kind of opening the door for those newer people to feel okay failing and knowing that it's all part of the process to get to that end goal.
Yeah, she talked about how Western culture has, at least traditionally, I think that's changed recently. Maybe in the past decade, you've seen this sort of change of embracing failure a little bit. But the Western culture historically is if we are doing it right, then we won't have any failure, versus that growth mindset, which is stretch and grow and try hard and develop rather than just lay up for par each and every time so that you don't fail. And so you have to have this sort of level of try. I mean, yes, it needs to be achievable, but it should also be a challenge, so much so that you don't always achieve full success.
Well, yeah, and I think you said it, Greg. If we're just really trying not to fail, if that's our big goal, we're never going to improve, or we likely won't improve. We'll just be doing the same thing over and over that we know will work. Whereas if we're willing to experiment and play a little bit and be okay with potentially failing, that's when you get those really great ideas, and that's when you start all the innovation that happens, and that's when you, I feel like, go beyond the goal and exceed everybody's expectations. Um, but of course, it can be scary. So I think it's important that we create that safe space for people, and kind of lead by example.
I think that's totally right. And not only do we want to think about creating that safe space for people that are in our organization, but we also have to think about the business goal. And if you don't allow for failure, not only, as you rightly said, do people not grow and learn, but also you don't achieve as much as you could. If you set audacious, big, bold goals, you're not going to hit it out of the park every time. You're not going to bat 1,000. You're going to have some failures. I did like the way we covered sort of the cost of failure.
Mhm.
You know, obviously we want to learn from failures, but man, they can sure sting on the income statement. And so I was asking about that, and I thought, what how do we sort of limit the cost of these failures? And Tracy said, don't fail externally if you can help it.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's when she was talking almost about like those failure labs and look at it like an experiment. And like like I think I mentioned I try to with new hires give them a little bit of room to fail intentionally, where if they do fail, it's not going to cost us $1 million. Like, okay, maybe we ruin like a $50 wall decal. I can live with that. And I think you can scale that as necessary. But I think it's a great first step to opening the door to that. The other big thing she mentioned was, regardless of the outcome, one thing that we often don't consciously think about is the importance of the reflection. So if we succeeded, why did we succeed? If we failed, why did we fail? And that's, I think, where you get a lot of the growth coming in.
Yeah, I call them postmortems
Yeah.
when you're doing big projects, like our acquisition. How did that go? And Kevin um, uh, ran a whole process to gather from all the stakeholders and participants thoughts so that we can take that and do a better job next time. And we'll keep doing these postmortems. Um, and then we talked about failure, how sometimes it should be 100% avoidable. And, you know, the airline pilot or the brain surgeon, you don't want any failure. Um, but it's sort of a continuum. How at some points you are embracing failure, at some points you are making the best of failure, and then at some points you may say, I don't need any failure here. It's too expensive, or it's too external, or what have you, or we expect you to have learned already at this point. Now go be successful.
Yeah. And I think that comes with the growth, right? I mean, med students go through so much training, and I'm sure a lot of them do not go on to become successful doctors and surgeons. I'm assuming for a reason. And I think that's where it's like, how long is the runway, but depending on like the end goal here. So I'm glad that we give the doctors so much trial where they can't fail too poorly, or too catastrophically before somebody's operating on a brain. I think that's important.
Yeah, failure. If you're going to fail in the proverbial cadaver lab and not in the OR. And also they have mechanisms to catch failure so that ultimately, the external is a success. So again, that goes back to keeping failures internal, and then we have checks. It's like in our engineering department, one engineer may have a failure, but because of the checks, the final product comes out as a success. So what would you say our goal is? Let me posit it, and you tell me whether I got it right. Okay,
Okay.
Caroline? So we want to have a safe space where people can fail early so that it's inexpensive, and have the good judgment to pivot when they do see that failure or that change in circumstances. And then that safe space ought to have everybody feel free to bring failures to light so they can be addressed.
Mhm. No, I think that's true. I think the only thing I would add is Tracy brought up the concept of thriving and all of the research that's been done around thriving. And I know we've talked about happiness before, so I was thinking it's kind of along those lines, but this was a bit more scientific. And she mentioned you need happiness, but also accomplishment and learning. And I think the learning and accomplishment comes in with the failures, right? Because you're going to learn, and then eventually, ideally, you're going to succeed and have that nice accomplishment. And then that plus happiness leads to the thriving mentality, which I would love to see everybody experience in our building. I think I think that might be a stretch goal,
Well,
but
we like stretch goals. We,
yeah.
we may succeed, we may not. It reminds me of that book, Winning Now, Winning Later,
Hmm.
David Cote. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that name right. Because if you're going to win now, you have to have results, that performance culture. You got to do that. If you're going to win later, you have to have that learning culture so you can grow and develop. And it's that dynamic tension, that we're trying to find the right balance.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think again, balance is key. Um, the last thing I want to call out is she also mentioned uniting people in teams through tasks, which I like, and I think it's almost like giving people that common goal, and that's how people can come together. And you either like fail together, or succeed together. But I think the real thing is you're learning together. And I think that right there is a great way to get people thinking on the same track. And it kind of forces that, maybe not forces, but strongly encourages them to work together toward a common goal. Because it's like, well, if one of us fails, we're all failing, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I liked that as well.
Well, we learned a lot. I hope we get it right. Um, that's sort of funny I say that. I didn't mean it to be a pun, but hopefully we don't fail at finding the right balance between the performance culture and the learning culture. Hopefully we get it right.
In our next episode, we will discuss the generational gap. There's always a lot of buzz around this topic, big reason why we wanted to cover it. So we really can't wait to hear from our next guest. We will be joined by coach and speaker Lindsay Picardo.